All right, everybody. Time to get into the show here a little bit. And I'm going to try to get rid of some of the notices that keep popping up on my computer. Today, we're going to take a quick look at the process of actually adding the signs to the structures. Now that we've got the signs basic weathering done and everything, Greg Cassidy is going to take us through his methodology of doing it and show us a couple of techniques and tricks that he uses. As usual, if any of you other gentlemen out there that are so inclined, please feel free to give us your input on your tricks and thoughts about ways to do this. Because again, as usual, there's 88 different ways to skin this cat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. Before I do turn it over to Greg, I'm going to note that he's drinking some seltzer. I think he said it was orange or tango flavored or something. I am not drinking my morning coffee today. I have changed over to the soda also, so my caffeine input is Dr. Pepper. So whatever you have there to keep your whistle wet, please partake in that, and remember to keep yourself hydrated as we move into the warmer season, and this weekend as it's supposed to be fairly warm all over the country. I just kind of say this because as a past EMT and things, I know that those guys are going to be busy with people who get themselves in trouble by not staying hydrated. So, all right, Greg, I'm going to get off my soapbox. It's all yours.
All right, thank you, Chris. Well, I appreciate him asking me back. I guess it means it wasn't too horrible last week. What I'm going to first warn you about is I'm working on my laptop, and it's a different microphone than I usually use, and it has a habit of inserting the word whenever I leave a silent moment. So it's not me. What I'd like to do first is do a share screen before we start going to the workbench. And I'm going to be talking with you about finding the right sign. I had a friend of mine who watched last week's video ask me, how do you get the right sign? What do you look for? If you're pulling it down off the web, you really want to see how good of an image it is. And sometimes you can't tell until you've downloaded it. And even though you might be shrinking it down real small, if you get in there with your camera and take a close-up picture of it, if it was a bad image to start with, and I mean bitmapped in the sense that the lines are more dots than an actual line, it's going to show up. One of the things that you can look for when you're looking for signs is whether you're looking at an actual picture or a graphic. Now, some examples I have here. This is an actual picture of a rusted sign. This is an image of a sign that's had rust added to it. And I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to print out a sign that has rust on it, sometimes it can save you some trouble of rusting the sign. And I'll go through a few more. Here we have some images where rust has been added. And then sometimes you can get into what you can tell is an actual photograph of a rusted sign. Sometimes you can tell because the corners might be bent, or in this case, it has a couple bullet shots in it. And in this case, you see how the corners where it was mounted are bent. There's nothing wrong with using an actual photograph of a sign, but you want to make sure it's a good photograph of it. Sometimes people who put signs online to show them off, they might be taken at an angle, or they might have glare from a light shining down on it. So make sure what you're downloading is a good image. This is an actual sign, and this one you can tell is an actual sign by the white there in the boarding where it's worn away, which is actually a nice effect and would be difficult to make if you had printed out an actual sign that didn't have that on it. This I know is an image with the rust added because it's being advertised as a retro sign. and they just print the image with the rust on a piece of steel and send it to you. So sometimes what you want to download can do some of the weathering for you already. There's nothing wrong with getting signs that already have rust on them. So one of the things I'm going to be showing you is two techniques I use for making posters or paper signs, such as posters for fairs or elections, and also painted on signs that could be painted on brick. Some people call them ghost signs, depending on how faded away they are. For my painted on signs, I use a technique where I'll print out the signs that I want to use. And then you can see I have a sheet of tissue paper here. I'll take that tissue paper and cover some of the signs that I wanted to be painted on, and just use a piece of tape on the leading edge as it's going to go back through the printer. And then I'll run it through the printer a second time. And it prints it onto that sheet of tissue paper. And I have not had any type of jam or anything so far, but I'm always very careful to make sure there's no folds or anything that might get caught. And then once I take it off, you see I have the image printed on a piece of tissue paper. This is the type of tissue paper that you can get for putting in packages that are wrapped. It's very thin, a fair bit transparent. So I'm going to end my share screen right now. And if we can go to my camera that's over my workbench, I'll show you what I'm going to be showing right now. These are two sheets that I printed out. Now this sheet is paper signs that I'm going to be showing you how I mount. And these are handbills, posters, stuff that might be glued onto a fence or onto a building. And then these are painted on signs I've done. And one thing I'd like to show you, we have here a Grolsch sign that the image I downloaded was actually rusted. And I was able to bring it into Photoshop and get rid of the rust if I wanted to use that as a painted on sign, because I've not seen a painted on sign with rust. If you enjoy doing signs, having an imaging program such as Photoshop or some of the other variations can be very useful. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how I would do a paper sign, and we'll go with a county fair sign right here. The first thing I would do is generally mark the area that it's going to be in, and I'll do it by holding it up and drawing a box around it with a pencil, so I have an area of where that sign is going to be. And the reason I do that is so I can sand the back of it. A lot of people use sandpaper. I have a sanding stick here that's roughly about 150 grit, and I'll just use it to sand the sign. And you've probably seen this technique before. It's just trying to make the paper thinner so that it doesn't look like the thickness of a piece of metal. If you're using it for a metal sign, you actually want to build up your thickness a little bit. But if you're using it for a paper sign, you want to thin it out some. I do try to be careful not to sand through the image. However, every now and then, if you tear one, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes that's something you'll want. Now, once I've sanded a lot of it, I'll dump off everything and I'll hold it up. And if I can see through it, which I don't know if you'll be able to, you can see where I've sanded it. I need to do a little more sanding down at the bottom part. And then once I've sanded through to where I can start to see the image on my workbench, and you can see now where you can pretty much see through it, then's when I'll go ahead and cut it out. And I'll typically use a really sharp blade, either in an X-Acto knife or a scalpel. And I'll sometimes also use a straight edge. For this demonstration, I'm not going to, but for paper signs, it doesn't matter as much as if you were cutting out a metal sign or something. So we now have this paper sign that's very thin, And I'm going to show you how I would attach it to a clapboard wall. Now, what I have here is a mixture of 50-50, and this is water and canopy glue. And I like to use canopy glue because once it dries, it is very clear, and it also starts out a little bit thinner than some of the white glues like Elmer's. And I also have a tiny bit of dish detergent in it to help cut down on water spotting. So I'll put a little bit of that on my sign here. And then I have a brush where I just kind of brush it around, try to get it on most of the sign. And then I'll go ahead and put the sign on my clapboard. Now, one thing you have to be a little careful of is if you press it down all over the place now and then want to try and get it in the clapboards, you're pulling it in two directions. So I'll usually just lay it there and then start at one spot. And I have a number of these. They're rubber pushers that are used for makeup and some other things. And I'll use them to just start pushing from the bottom into the clapboard. I like using these because you can get right up into the clapboard. But if you don't have those, using just some type of stippling brush will also work. And that's basically just pushing it into all of the pieces of clapboarding. And you can see how basically you're trying to get it so that it settles into those ridges that the clapboard makes. And then one of the things that I'll often do on a sign like this, if it's supposed to be a poster or something that's been put up, especially if it's there for a little while, I'll very often take a corner and maybe bend it over a little bit, or sometimes take part of it and tear it so that you get the kind of image like it's been there for a while. And that type of effect works the same on a brick wall. This is a poster that could have been on the brick wall for a while. So that's my technique for applying them. In a little bit, we'll come back and show you something else that I can do to make them look like they've been there for a while. What I'd like to do now is show you how I work with painted on signs. And this is my tissue that I printed out. I've already cut a couple signs out of it. One of the things about painted on signs, if you're applying them on brickwork, which is more often where you see them, they are sometimes on wooden buildings, but you tend to see them on brick buildings more often. If by using the tissue paper, it's very thin. And if you're working with a dark colored brick, it tends to show through, so you don't get to see the image very well. You can see that bottom one I just put right over the brick. Now this top one, it's the same type of image, but the reason you can see it better is I painted a white square behind it first. Now that allows the painted on sign to stand out a little bit more. Then we can come back and do whatever type of weathering on top of it that we want to make it a ghost sign. And I'll show you how I apply one of those. On this brick wall, I'm going to be putting my 7-Up sign on. What I first did was I put it in place and I just put masking tape around the outside of it and then spray painted it with a white. So that gives me a white that's the same size. So this is my tissue paper and I'm going to cut out the 7-Up sign. If I don't stab myself with my scalpel. It didn't fall on the point, fortunately. Now this stuff is quite thin, and I have now and then wrecked one or two just because it tore while I was working with it. You can print out a number of them if you have one that you really want to have show up. So this is my tissue paper sign. If I were to put glue on that, it would end up soaking through and gluing it onto whatever surface that I'm working on. So what I do in that case is put my glue on the wall, and then I come back with my stippling brush, and this is just a glue brush that I use for purposes like this, and pat it down like that. So it's all over the white area where I'm going to stick the sign. And then I put it down, and you really don't want to handle it too much until you get it pressed down a bunch. And that's where I'll come back with my brush after I've stuck it in some water so it's been rinsed off, and then push down on it like this. And the water, along with the glue that's underneath it, helps it to settle in to all of that brickwork that you have there. And you can see now, you can see the brickwork through it. So it's taken on that texture. And if I had just put that over the brick, it would look more like this. This one does have a little bit of weathering over it, but it really darkens it if you just put it over a brick, unless you have a very light colored brick. So putting the white down ahead of time helps it look like it's been painted on, which at that point you can do whatever weathering over it you want. Now, I'm going to let that dry for a moment. And if we can switch back to my laptop zoom camera, I'm going to take that moment to show you something else that I did in making a sign. And this is, again, a way where you can use a photo editing program to almost make any sign you want, depending on the program and your skills. This was a sign for a garage that I was working on, I guess about a year and a half ago. And the kit came with a sign, but I didn't like it, and I wanted to get sort of an Art Deco sign of my own. So I went looking online, and I found this particular sign here, and I really liked it. Now, it was part of an iStock, but having come from having come from the graphic world, and now we're not stepping through my signs. Why not? I may not be able to show you this if I can't step through my signs. Oh, I know what happened. Let me stop this share. I didn't open all of them. I only opened the first one. Okay, here we go. So once I found that sign, I went ahead, I had to purchase it, but I went ahead and bought it because I knew that I'd be able to use it a couple of times. And that was the sign that I got. It's a vector piece of artwork, which means it's not bitmapped. All of the lines were drawn using mathematics, and then they were filled. So in order for me to work with it, I brought it into Photoshop and rasterized it so it was a bitmap sign. Once I did that, then I created this piece, which covered the word premium and that stuff in the top, and was where I wanted to put my word, which was Shorty's, because this is Shorty's Garage. So I wanted to find an Art Deco type font to put in there. Now you can go online and find all kinds of free fonts. So I found three that I liked. This one is Selznick, Studebaker, and Cleveland Demo. So I tried each one in there. And it was funny, it wasn't until I got to the third one where I noticed that font that I had picked is almost identical to what was in the original sign. And I said, well, by gosh, that's what I'm going to have to use. So I then printed that out and made a printout of it. And just like we did metal signs last week, I used the sponge method, put some rust on it, put it on my building, and then had a little bit of rust streaking down from it. And that's how I made my Shorty's gas sign. So if you can't find exactly what you want, there's nothing says you can't try to make it if you have the right program and a little bit of imagination. So now I'd like to go back to my camera and I'll show you what we're going to do to these signs now that they're already on the building. So for my county fair sign, which is just a poster, I won't do very much to it. You can't have rust on it. But one thing that I do like to do is I'll take one of my lighter pigments, and this one happens to be made by Earth Pigments. And I have quite a few brushes that I use when I apply artist pigments. I'll take one of them and take a slight bit of that pigment and brush it on it. And what that does is it gives it a little bit of a faded effect, as if the color of the building is showing through. Now, it helps to have a pigment that's the color of the building you're working with. This is something where Chris, with his soft pastels, has an infinite variety of colors. I have a few, but not nearly as many as I could use sometimes. So that's how I will end up finishing off a paper sign. And then that could go on a wall, it could go on a fence, you could have that anywhere. And as I say, these can work for election signs, they can work for fair signs, they can work for movie posters, almost anything you can think of where they might use a poster for it. Now, for the painted on sign, what I'll do with that is there's a couple of ways that I will make it look like it's been on there for a while. One way is if I have a pan pastel that's a similar shade of the back wall, and this one's a lovely brick color, I'll use that to just go over the sign a little bit and kind of make it look like it's been on there for a while. And the paint is sort of fading away. And again, this is something where I'm sure soft pastels would probably work just as well. And you can see now we're starting to have the effect of the sign looking like it's been painted on for a while and the paint's fading away. One thing on this particular one, I have a very coarse type of brick pattern. This is a piece of hydrocal actually. On laser cut brick, which we get in many kits, depending on how wide the mortar lines are cut, it might not show up that it's actually painted on the brick that much. And I've done one thing here on this bottom one. You can see how for the bottom half of it, and my light isn't showing it very well, but for the bottom half of it, I scored through each line of bricks, and it shows that it's actually got the texture of the brick on it, as opposed to the top half where I didn't. So that ends up helping it look like it's been painted on the brick more than just having it on there. And I think that's about all I have to say about how I put painted on signs and paper poster signs onto buildings. If anybody has any questions.
Yes, I do, Chris. Pat here. I just wondered what did you use to, you said you cut through the paper with did you use a regular X-Acto knife or something, or
No, this is,
to make that brickwork come through it?
I just used a scalpel.
Okay.
And what I did, I would just follow each line, and either a sharp X-Acto or a scalpel will work. And so when you're going through in this direction, it's really easy.
So you go right through it, eh?
Yeah. And then in this direction, if you start, because it's every other line, if you have a real light touch, it kind of bounces through each one.
Okay.
And again, gives you the impression that it's actually painted on the brick. It's not just like a piece of paper sitting on top of the brick.
Great idea.
But
Thank you.
It really depends on the brick wall you're working with and the scale that you're working with.
Yeah, all scale's a little easier.
Yeah, with scale you have bigger mortar lines, and scale you have minuscule mortar lines. You're lucky if you can even see them.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred. Greg.
I have a couple of questions for you, Greg. First of all, with that, taking the one that you've got there in your hand right now to the next step, or either one of any of those on the bricks, have you ever tried to use anything like salvo set or something on top of that to kind of make it act a little bit more like a water slide decal and snuggling down?
Snuggling it down. I have not tried any of those. They might work, but since you're not working with decal film, you're working with, in that case, actually thin tissue paper. I would imagine that possibly a thin solution of white glue, like my 50-50 mix of canopy glue and water or something like that, could work just as well, because you're not really dealing with a cling film like you would with a decal. But I think any type of fluid like that will allow it to relax and settle into that texture will help.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going after. And also, I don't know, and maybe somebody out there can verify this, but since the pastel demonstration, I've been informed that pan pastels are actually a superfine oil pastel and not a regular pastel. I haven't verified that, so I don't know. But that's one thing I'm just going to throw out. I just got that input here recently. To me, there's a little bit of a difference, but I haven't really checked them out compared to the regular pigments or pastels. So
I think there is a difference. I'm not well versed enough in the soft pastels to tell you exactly how they work differently. I think these being in cake format might have maybe a little more of the binder in them. It doesn't say on the bottom any ingredients, whether it actually contains, but it does say not for cosmetic use.
Yes. But yeah, no, and so I was just, I agree with you, and I use the pan pastels a lot and things. I'm just throwing it out there that if somebody wants to try it in the process of learning with the pastels and with the pigments and things here, that maybe a terp or something might work with the pan pastels. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm just throwing out that information because it's something that I haven't verified and haven't found out yet. Greg, if you hold up your pigments there.
Yeah, I was going to say pigments would also work for what I was just doing if I had a brick color one. I do have, I use them a lot for rusting and for applying dirt and stuff. I have some darker ones like a raw umber and black and a couple other dark colors. If I had a brick color, it would work just as well going over that sign to make it look like it was a ghost sign. I just don't
Right.
happen to have that brick shade right now. But these things I think are incredible values. You, depending on the color, you can get containers this size for somewhere from $7 to $16, and this will last me a lifetime.
Yeah, and for those that missed the pigment installment, or excuse me, soft pastel installment, the difference between pigments and soft pastels are pigments are just that. It's a paint pigment, very finely ground, what is used for watercolors, acrylic paints, you name it. The soft pastels are nothing more than a pigment with a binder added. And the binder is typically something like a gum arabic or something. And then there are usually 2 or 3 different colors of pigments blended together to give the value that they're looking for in that particular color hue, whatever you want to call it, of the stick of pastel. So pigment, basic bottom line, pigments are just straight dirt, pigment or man-made, whatever. The soft pastels are multiple pigments plus a binder.
Just a very fine powder.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, if any of you in the past had worked with any of these type of rust powders, it's the same thing. It's just these marketed for model railroaders very often can cost more. This one, $7. I'm going to say it's identical to this one, which holds almost twice as much, which was also $7.
Yeah, yeah, and some of the weathering powders also have a pressure sensitive adhesive added to the powder. So, but yeah, Greg's absolutely correct. They're basically one and the same for our purposes, because unless you're really working on styrene where you need that, you know, or some surface that's really slick and closed, not porous at all, you'll find that maybe that adhesive may or may not work for you. But there's some other tricks of the trade that work better than relying on that adhesive. All right. Another thing that I had a question to Greg on, and I'm going to put him on the spot here. Some of the folks out there, particularly in YouTube land, may not have all of the graphic tools and everything that you've got. Since you've shown us in particular how you apply the signs and things, would you mind sharing your main sheet of graphics there that you cut the 7-Up bottle out of and stuff, so that we could throw it up on the website and a link to that and
Sure.
download that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and send them to you as a PDF.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And if you could, that'd be absolutely wonderful. Actually, it's going to be Will who's going to put them up, but you know, you can copy me or send it to me and we'll get them. But
Okay.
thank you very, very much on that.
I will point out for anybody who gets them, one of the things I'll often do when I'm first and the actual layout here, I just use Publisher, which comes on virtually every Windows machine. You know, there are fancier programs, but you don't need them. I'll often make a box of the size of roughly the sign that I want to use. And then when I place all my signs on the sheet, I know what size to scale them to. It saves you from putting a whole bunch on a sheet, printing it out, and then, you know, it's either too big or too small for what you had intended.
That tip right there was worth the price of admission. So thank you. Yeah.
My pleasure.
That's the graphic arts background and printer background that you bring to the table, that you know, that's worth the cost of admission. You just saved me printing about 20 pages today. So, all right. And then
I have a question,
Shoot.
Greg.
Yes.
Yeah, this may take more than a minute. I'm not very high tech, but I do have Photoshop elements. Could you explain if it takes more than a minute? Don't, but if you could, in quickly to save your voice. How do you take a poster and then put your own name on there? That's the part I didn't understand.
Well, Photoshop Elements has a text tool in it. And once you get that text tool, if you have your sign brought in and you have a place where you want to put some text in, use the text tool. It's near the bottom on the left-hand side of the toolbars.
Yeah, I know the text tool. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and you'll get a separate layer and you can start typing on that layer. Then it's just a matter of going and finding whatever font you want to use. And any font that you have loaded into your Windows application will be accessible by Photoshop. And you just find whatever font you like, and then you start scaling it and sizing it to how you want.
I see.
Now,
I thought, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Okay, one caveat.
I thought I thought you said something about changing it to a bitmap.
Oh, well, that particular image, when I bought it, it came as a vector image. And the difference between a vector and a raster image is a vector image is made out of lines that are all mathematically put in place, and they're completely scalable up and down without losing any resolution. Bitmapped images or raster images are all based on pixels, and the larger you make it from the original size, the bigger those pixels get. The smaller you make it, the smaller they get. And that's where sometimes you might see an image that it started out small and someone's enlarged it, and all of a sudden you get some like stair steps, or what we call as jaggies. And that can kind of degrade the image itself because it now looks low resolution. And that's one thing I wanted to say. When you bring an image into Photoshop, it's going to have its own resolution. And we did have programs at work where you could change the resolution, but I doubt anybody at home would have one of those. So you're pretty much stuck with the resolution you have unless you're reducing it. But if you're typing something in, your text is going to go in at the same resolution as the bitmap that you brought in, the image that you brought in. So if you bring in a kind of a low res image and then you go to type a name on it, you know, Joe's Bar or something, it might not look that sharp because it's dealing with the image. It's dealing with the rasterization of the lines per inch, the dots per inch of that image. And it's going to have to stick with those because it can't do any better than that. And sometimes you don't notice that in an actual image. Like if we're looking at this poster of Dr. No, the images of James Bond and all those lovely Bond girls next to him, they can be slightly low resolution and you're not going to notice. But those words, Dr. No, if they're low resolution, because they're made up of straight lines, it'll stand out more. So it's always best to find as high a resolution of an image to start with. Now, if you're downloading it off the web, you know, it's a shooting gallery as to what you're going to end up getting. But when you type in any words, and most any photo editing program will do that, like Inkscape or Photoshop or some others. The type you type in is going to pick up the resolution of that photograph, so it may not look quite as sharp as you'd like, and there's really no way around that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Sure, I hope I didn't go in too deep.
No, not at all. It's the type of information, and that's why we're here, because you're giving us some really, really good input that a lot of us, A, don't know to even consider, and B, now we understand what we're doing, and C, it gives us a clue to look for a higher quality images when we're out there doing those midnight searches. So, yeah, excellent. Anybody else have some questions for Greg?
Greg, could you show us again how you copied onto the tissue paper? From
Yes,
one-
I can. Give me 1/2 moment to pull that up.
Yeah, and the setup on that is really important because that's something that I kind of missed too.
Okay.
Yeah, what are you using for your tape and stuff?
Okay, so let me bring up share screen. So I'm just using normal Scotch Magic tape. I first print it out on my sheet of paper so I know where the signs are going to be on that sheet of paper. Then I'll take a piece of the tissue paper and I have the scissors. I ended up cutting it so there was no folded edges like you can see along the edge here. You want it as smooth and flat as possible. And then in this case, the leading edge of the paper would be here at the top. And I taped it on with the tape at the leading edge. I only used a couple little pieces of tape to hold it in place, but made sure it was very flat so it wouldn't catch on anything as it goes through the printer. And then once it went through the printer, it printed the images in the exact same place. And so now they're on the tissue paper.
Do you tape both the top, bottom, and sides, or just the
No,
top?
just the top, because once the top gets through, the rest is going to be flat and follow it. It's going through rollers. And the more tape, the more risk of something catching.
Okay,
So I only, in that sheet, the tape is still on there. So I only have the tape there and there on the two leading edges.
okay, and the tape it's applied so that about 50% of it is on the tissue and 50% of it
Yep.
is on the paper?
If you don't mind going to Bar Mill's site, they have an entire workshop on this exact process, step by step. It's really understandable, and you can see the entire process there.
Okay, I'll have to look at that.
Yeah, great input. Thank you. All right.
Get out of
So
share.
this is why we have the name of the game and have a bunch of people here, because only by pooling our brain trust can we get through some of this stuff. So are there any other thoughts, questions, or comments for Greg here while we've still got him? All right. Well, then, Greg, I want to thank you very, very much. That was just outstanding in my mind. And the factor didn't come up a whole lot. So
Thank you, Chris.
So anyway, all right, let's go on ahead and move a little bit forward here, guys. I am going to take the next step here and move my computer up above as I always do. And so now we get to take a look. And if we can jump over to the desktop here and give that a full screen. Wonderful. The first thing that